Professor in the Faculty of Native Studies, and she's going to be presenting her work on navigating Indigenous research ethics and praxis. Nykkie, we're so honored that you've joined us and that you're here opening this new academic year with us, with your work, with your words, with your wisdom. I give the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. First and foremost, Elder Hillier, Nanaskom Tinmiste He Hi Hi. Thank you so much. I'm very grateful to you for sharing your stories with us and for getting us started off in a good way. Before I get started, I'd also like to say a few other thank yous, acknowledging the Anti-Racism Lab as well as the Borderlines Project that makes this series possible, all the doctoral students and everyone in the audience here to learn about these important topics. Um, and last but not least, I'd like to acknowledge my research team of two amazing doctoral students, Shiva Kieras and Chris Cromwell, in the Faculty of Native Studies, as they were on this project. And this project was SSHRC funded, so an acknowledgement to and gratefulness to SSHRC for funding as well. What I'm going to talk about today, I was asked to do this presentation to talk about how to do Indigenous research in a good way as part of this series. While that I think would take an entire course over an entire semester, I thought what I would do instead is to share an actual ongoing research project that I'm doing with my grad students to really illustrate how to do this kind of research and walk you through uh, all of the decisions I had to make along the way to really model that for you. A lot of times, Indigenous research can be viewed from other disciplines as somehow not as rigorous, not as methodologically and theoretically oriented, and that's absolutely not the case, as we'll see today. So the project is called Confronting Nationalist Narratives, Educating Newcomers About Indigenous Canada. And this really sets the scene. You see the Canadian flag here against a blue sky. Looks lovely. So I'll talk about Canada's reputation on the global stage for a moment. Oftentimes, Canada's upheld as the model of successful multiculturalism, especially compared to the United States. We're seen as the nice northern neighbor. And in fact, where racism and hate speech and so on is so high profile in the States, oftentimes Canada is imagined as as a place where that doesn't happen. We're the nice version in the North, and that's not true. Racism absolutely happens here in Canada. It's just talked about in a different way and often packaged under the guise of liberal rights and helping discourses of helping out and saving and so on. Um, what you're seeing on your screen, this Welcome to Canada piece, this is the impetus for the project. So newcomers, when they arrive to Canada, whether as refugees, as permanent resident, new immigrant hopefuls, and so on, they're handed this 148-page book called Welcome to Canada, the French version's Bienvenue au Canada. And so this is a first line of information about the country, how to be Canadian, what it's all about, this new home. And the problem uh, is that out of those 148 pages of content, there's about 3 paragraphs about Indigenous peoples. So it's very surface level. It really doesn't tell, in 3 paragraphs, what possibly could someone new to Canada learn about Indigenous peoples. So it's very surface level. We're here, we're First Nations, Métis, non-status, and Inuit. We have some rights, some hunting rights and sovereignty, and we're all over the country and speak languages. So this is very problematic. And the reason this is problematic is that it really doesn't it doesn't prepare people for how to become Canadian. This was taken up by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as well in their calls to action 93 and 94. So looking at 93 here, it reads, "We call upon the federal government in collaboration with the national Aboriginal organizations to revise the information kit for newcomers to Canada and its citizenship test to reflect a more inclusive history of the diverse Aboriginal peoples of Canada, including information about the treaties and the history of residential schools." So this is very problematic. And then the number 94 talks about the citizenship test specifically. Um, I'm troubled with the focus on history. So while there certainly is a problem, and only 3 paragraphs in an entire book is a problem, focusing only on history doesn't uh, equip newcomers with the fact that we're still here today. It's almost a form of erasure, if you will, that situates us and our concerns and our peoples somewhere back in time as a problem of long ago. And so when we start to unravel the narrative a bit, um, the wider context here is that although newcomers, uh, especially if they've chosen to come to Canada, may have the choice of what city or town they want to immigrate to. And so that's at the very local level. However, in Canada, all newcomers have to go through the federal, so that's the countrywide immigration process. So that makes the federal government the most significant agent of education and socialization. The problem here is that racism, including anti Indigenous racism, based on stereotypes, is pervasive in Canada. And there's a lot of social science research that shows that many newcomers adopt these troubling attitudes. In other words, as folks come to Canada, they don't know the stereotypes, but they learn them, they hear them, or they see the negative stories in the media. They may see peoples on the street, but without the background context, there's nothing to unpack that. There's no way to make sense. And so, they're picking up um, these stereotypes, the research tells us. And this is really troubling. The two fastest growing demographics in Canada are newcomers and Indigenous peoples. And so, my main argument is that we need to better understand this problem, and we need to find community level opportunities to build better relations and develop appropriate resources. Because a resource at the national level is not appropriate. It's surface level, and it's also pan-indigenizing. So there are many, many groups and very diverse groups of Indigenous peoples all across all of the provinces and territories. And so a pan-Indigenous, as if we're all one group, approach is very problematic. And although folks may go through the federal immigration system, eventually they're going to be in cities. And what racism looks like in Edmonton will be different in Vancouver, different in Quebec, and so on. This really needs to be a local level. So, in terms of thinking, okay, I've identified the problem, I have a position. How do I start this research? How do I think about, what do I want to know? And this is where I'm going to walk you through now how I did this uh, with Indigenous methodological commitments. Um, I should say my background is in political science, and I'm in the Faculty of Indigenous Studies now since 2016. And so I am coming at this research from a social science view. Indigenous studies is a very diverse discipline. So this kind of research might look different for someone, say, who focuses in healthcare or law or the arts and humanities. Um, as a discipline, because we center Indigenous peoples and their experiences, um, It's methodologically diverse, which means we choose from many methods, but it doesn't mean that that's any less rigorous or any less work. In fact, it's often more with our community relations than other disciplines in the university. So, the first methodological commitment, before I even thought about, okay, how am I going to do this work? My team and I sat down together to think about what are we coming in with? What do we want to commit to do this research in a good way that aligns with uh, critical Indigenous ethics? So the first is Indigenous story work. And this is a methodology that sustains and invigorates stories and narratives to help change the narrative of our peoples. And so this puts Indigenous cultures and teachings, governing ethics of respect and responsibility at the forefront. So we knew we wanted to base our work in story. We also took a desire based approach. So, what this means, this is coming from the work of Eve Tuck. What that means is a lot of times uh, our peoples are talked and our communities are talked about as if they're only damaged and broken in perpetual victimhood or in some kind of a deficit. A desire-based approach looks at the complexity of the person, as Tuck explains. And so what this says is that yes, absolutely, has there been trauma? Yes. Is that ongoing? Yes. Are there human rights violations and such? Yes. But the desire based approach also recognizes that we're more than just trauma and damage. We're also people that have a thriving culture and are capable agents and have agency. We also subscribe to a refusal based methodology. And so, and this is coming from the work of Tuck and Yang. So, what are we refusing? We're refusing to harvest stories of pain. So, we didn't want to replicate. Work that just talked about Indigenous peoples, or even, even the newcomers that we wanted to talk to, and I'll get to who we spoke to in a bit here. It wasn't about trauma. Those weren't the stories that we wanted to look at. That's been covered, and that wasn't the purpose, and that wasn't the place of this work. And from the work of Cree scholar Sean Wilson, we also methodologically committed to work that's relational, respectful, and reciprocal. And so, with these in mind, thinking about, okay, we wanted to focus on stories and people's personal stories. We wanted to look at more than trauma. We were refusing pain and trauma for the purpose of this work. And we wanted to be relational, respectful, and reciprocal. So, now, how do you design a research project out of that? And so, especially for any researchers and the doctoral students watching this video or on the call, hopefully this will be a useful model for you. So, the research design tasks. What did we have to do first? Uh, so the first one. Sorry about this. First thing that you have to do when you come to your research is ask yourself, what do I want to know? And so, in the case of this work, it was, what do newcomers know about Indigenous Canada? Because thinking back to the book and thinking back to that research that talked about newcomers adopting these attitudes, negative attitudes and stereotypes, I thought, well, maybe a step back made sense. What do newcomers know in the first place? Maybe what would they want to know? Are we maybe assuming that they're picking up on these stereotyping and racial cues? So once you know what you want to know, then you need to ask yourself, what methods are going to help me find out? So for the purpose of this work, And again, thinking about that ethic of, storytelling, reciprocity, empowerment, we chose to use the community-based research methods of storytelling and theater of the oppressed. Specifically, what we used, and I'll talk about it in a bit more detail later, is a community-based improv participatory theater called playback theater. And I'll get to that in a bit. So this was a way of thinking about story and a way to approach story. I'll have to go back in my slides for a moment here. So then, once we've decided, okay, we're going to use this playback approach. We're going to use community-based theater that's based in storytelling. We need to think about our research sample, right? Or in plain language, who will I ask? I want to know what newcomers know about Indigenous Canada. We're going to use this theater, interactive theater method. Who are we going to ask? And so the group that we worked with was an Afghan refugee group that were new to Edmonton. And so many of these folks, we had 20 participants in total, and many of them came with international human rights experience. And this will become relevant in a bit when we talk about the findings here. And so, how did we come to meet with this Afghan group? They actually came to us. So um, when they arrived in Edmonton in 2021 as refugees with the most current attacks from the Taliban, um, many in the group had actually worked with Theater of the Oppressed back in Kabul. And so they actually approached Native Studies and approached Playback Theater Group here in Edmonton, asking to work with us, saying they wanted to work with us. And this was absolutely amazing. Um, and so, why? This gave an opportunity for co creation. So, one ethic of good Indigenous research isn't going in with a rigid program to go into, a community and say, okay, here's what I want to know, but rather, what can we learn together? What what can we do? Um, and then it also responded to local community needs and asks. Sorry, my slides are a bit disorganized here. Okay. Locality is very important, and we always need to justify our case studies. So when we ask, why Edmonton, right? Why this group? Okay, they came to us. Why Edmonton? Edmonton's an interesting case because when we think about where newcomers are coming to, it's often Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal. But in recent years, more and more, especially because of affordability reasons, more and more newcomers are coming to the prairies, and especially to Edmonton, one of the big cities. There's a very high visibility of Indigenous peoples in the city of Edmonton, where that may not be the case as much as, say, Toronto or Montreal, where communities tend to be in the surrounding areas. Of course, they're in the cities, just not necessarily as visible. And from the work of Métis scholar Chris Anderson, he says that, in a nutshell, local issues effectively reduce the ability to position racism and privilege as someplace else and highlight how we all have a role in structures of colonialism and racism. So we know what we're going to do with those methods. Just finding another slide here. As I was preparing them right before, some of them got moved. So we had to ask ourselves, how, okay, we have this data, all right, we have our, the people that we're going to ask, we have our method in hand, we have our guiding ethics. What will we do next? How will we analyze the data? So we took this from the approach of grounded theory. There's a star here because grounded theory is both a method and a methodology. So what this means um, is that you don't uh, go in to the data with a strict set of formulas. So you're not going in with a strict discourse or coding frame, but rather and looking for specific things. Instead, you're letting the data speak to you. And what that means is instead of going in and asking specific and pointed questions, letting people tell their own stories and then thinking about what that means after they've shared what they want to share, not what you want them. So while the prompt, was what did you know about Indigenous Canada, they could share any story that they wanted to. And then in terms of, okay, once we have all this wealth of data, once everyone's shared their stories, what will we do? We looked at it from a critical discourse analysis. Uh, and that's an overarching research method. We specifically used a thematic analysis. So this is where you're looking at, what everyone said and looking for major themes. So we'll take a step back and I'll talk about then. So we knew, okay, we had our research design in place. We knew what our method was. Then we're going to do this playback theater event. And here's what we did, right? We would call this fieldwork in research terms for those of you in the doctoral program. Again, plain language, where we went and what we did. So we had our playback event at the Edmonton Public Library in downtown Edmonton. It was a deliberate choice not to do this in the university, um, simply because we wanted to be out in the community and not necessarily in a place where it could be, especially as a newcomer, as a non-academic. Universities, while they can be welcoming, especially when you're asking people to share their stories and meet, it can have an air of very like formality and rigidity and this hierarchy, which we didn't want to do. So I'll talk about our attendees. So the group, the Afghan group that we worked with, were 20 folks, all from Afghanistan. Again, many had 10 years plus of experience as international human rights activists. And so while a few, especially our international activists, spoke English quite well, many didn't, because again they came as refugees. They hadn't planned on coming to Canada, let alone Edmonton, so it's not like they had years of working on English or French before coming here. So they spoke Farsi, and so we had a translator come in, and so all the researchers, the research team, and all of the playback actors, we had were Indigenous, Black, East and Southeast Asian, uh, as well as Middle Eastern. So we had, it was a very, I guess, BIPOC, to use a catch-all phrase, team. So right away, there was a sense of folks from all over the world with a whole bunch of different experiences. So we had, so how playback theater works is that people will share a story, and if they want it played back to them by the actors, they play it back. So there's not a stage or anything. We're all sitting together in a circle. We're sitting in a room, and we had a Métis musician on the piano to give some drama and some musical suspense as well to it. But before we did any of that, before, going in, with the rigidity of, okay, we're going to sit at a table and someone's going to have a tape recorder or a phone and we're going to record this, we didn't do that. We started with tea and bannock. We started the day just breaking bread, having tea, introducing our Afghan newcomers to tea and bannock, especially with different kinds of jams. So they were really excited about that. So just to talk and do this. So our data collection strategy, to use these terms, again, wasn't to be sitting there formally recording, because we didn't feel like that was, a really ethical way that we wanted to conduct that. We really wanted to break that hierarchy between like researcher and research subject, because that's not how we approached our group at all. Nothing was recorded, and how we took the notes is, uh, we simply took notes on what people were saying, and it was, so these were hard copy pen and paper notes. Um, one of uh, one of the graduate students, one of the doctoral student researchers, was taking notes specifically on visual cues, because she's from Iran, and also spoke Farsi. It, Iran and Afghanistan are not the same country, but there's a lot of cultural similarities in terms of some of the mannerisms and the nonverbal cues. So her role was to write down any nonverbal cues. Uh, as being from that region, she would be able to recognize them in ways that others of us didn't. The other researcher and I then took notes on what we were hearing and what people were saying. So we were paying attention to nonverbal as well as cues. Again, just pen and paper. Um, all the data was anonymized, so that was our strategy going in, and that was made clear for everyone. So then how we started is we did introductions, including the researchers and all the playbacks. So everyone on the team introduced themselves, and we had a sharing circle. We shared a bit of our story and, why we all thought that was important. And then afterwards, we did the playback event. So again, this is not formal professional theater. So although the actors are trained and they're really good and the musician was amazing, right? This is not professional. We're all just in a room in the library, having some fun. So how it works is, folks can share a story. And then the actors will play it back, and if they choose, if the storyteller chooses to have it acted out for them on improv, um, and although it's not meant as a therapy, although it's been used in art therapy, it can actually be quite cathartic. So, there was laughter, there were tears, even though we weren't asking any pain narratives, a lot of, just sharing together. A lot of us, myself included, shared some tough stories as well about, experiences with racism and kind of the myth of Canada as well, which was, when we get to the findings, we can talk about. Um, and it concluded with a firework activity, and I'll talk about what that is in a moment here. And then once the playback portion was done, we were almost out of time and going to get kicked out of the room. We concluded with Persian food, so a Persian lunch. We had several dietary requirements that we had to attend to, so Afghan food wasn't possible to get catered, but Persian food, which is very similar in terms of the spices. We thought it was important to start with food, to start and end the event with food, and to have fun together, because this wasn't just a research event, it was also a way of, sharing and having that ethic of reciprocity and respect, and not just, coming in, but really connecting and making friends um, with everyone as peers. So that was really exciting. In terms of the main findings, we found some major themes. If you recall, we were doing a thematic analysis. So, we had a whole bunch of notes, Chris, Shiva, and myself, and we got together afterwards and we transcribed it all. And then we coded it by hand, with different colored highlighters. Okay, here are some different themes emerging. And so one of the big ones was erasure. And this wasn't on, by with any intention from our Afghan group, but rather we say erasure because many of our participants knew nothing about Indigenous Canada, let alone Indigenous peoples in Canada. And especially for those who had worked in international human rights, even, some even, working in London, England, and such, and being, speaking fluent English, being well traveled, the myth of Canada as the multicultural success story, the strength of that was really surprising for us because, for folks who, around the world who don't even know anything or were surprised that Indigenous people are still there is very problematic. And it speaks to, again, that over focus on history, um, as very troubling because, again, putting us back in time. This is a form of erasure because we're still here and we're here now. Um, some had heard stereotypes about Indigenous people, and a lot of these came from popular culture movies like Dances with Wolves, for instance, and such. Um, and I'll speak to this again in a moment. Um, but then also, a lot had this sense of connection and solidarity, and this really emerged from the stories and from the sharing circle. I put a star here because, okay, we're thinking about erasure in terms of, not knowing anything about Indigenous peoples or that we even still exist, or only having heard the stereotypes. And one thing that a lot of them said is that, again, movies like Pocahontas or Dances with Wolves, they only knew the stereotypes and they didn't know why because they didn't know anything about indigeneity in Canada, but they knew it wasn't quite right. It didn't sit well with them because they just had a hunch, like it didn't make sense, right? That there had to be more to it than that. um and again, that sense of connection and solidarity, because in Afghanistan it's also very diverse. Our refugee group also had different experiences with colonialism and imperialism, and not to suggest that these experiences are parallel, right? What coloniality looks like in Canada looks differently in Afghanistan, looks differently in Southeast Asia, and so on. But it's still that, and so that's why I use this term coloniality. So it's not white settler colonialism like we experience here, but coloniality nonetheless. And so that's important, and I'll speak to why in a minute. Another thing that you always want to be thinking about in your research and as you're coming up with, your findings, it's one thing to, okay, here's what we found, here's our themes. Especially in the social sciences, we need to think about the implications, or what I'm calling the so what factor, right? So it's like, okay, you have this data, you have these findings. Why do those matter? Well, they matter because uh, it suggests that these national myths of Canada as the land of milk and honey, as the nice northern neighbor to the US, as the non racist neighbor, it endures, right? In other words, Canada has been very successful in terms of public relations on the international scene. And that was something that came out as well, for our participants, is that, um, although they were in an emergency situation as refugees to get out of the country, they did have a choice of a few different places they could have gone. In other words, what plane they were going to get onto. And so one of the places they shared was Germany. Uh, with the history of Nazism, not to say that that is still what it's like, but with the history of all the baggage that's happened, they didn't want to go to Germany. The United States was another, but with Trumpism, with the high profile, racism and the racial divide in the U.S., they didn't want to experience that, and so they chose Canada. Only to find that, well, the same racism, these same problems exist, just it's not talked about. So that is a very interesting so what. It also tells us, especially when we're thinking about stereotypes and popular culture, right, where learning is taking place. So even before people even think about coming to Canada from all over the world, right, they're watching these movies and that's what they see us as, right? As, somewhere in the Wild West, either not existing at all or existing outside of the cities, outside of modernity and let alone futurity, right? Um, but Going back to the connection and solidarity, this was very interesting because it also tells us something about the newcomer desire to learn. Our participants, our group was so excited and genuinely excited to learn about Indigenous peoples in a good way and to learn something different from either the fact that, okay, well, they didn't know we existed or they only knew the stereotypes. And why that's important, this is the star on here to go back to that connection and solidarity. It challenges that social science literature that I mentioned earlier, right? So when we read some of the work, from political science, from sociology and stuff, we see, oh, okay, there's all these surveys that tell us anti-Indigenous racism and stereotyping is rampant. People are coming new to Canada and they're picking up on these troubling attitudes. However, our findings show the exact opposite, which is really interesting. And we wanted to then think about why, right? Why that is the case. And then perhaps it also speaks to, why that hyper local approach is better than a federal approach. Because there was opportunity for real change and learning, which led us to our recommendations then. If we're going to create new and appropriate resources rather than, does that Welcome to Canada guide need a good edit? Absolutely. But if we're going to have resources, they need to be localized because again, I mean, even the diversity. There are different Indigenous groups in Ontario than there are in the prairies than there is in BC, and so on. This needs to be localized. This is at the local level. It needs to be accurate and current. It can't be surface level, and it can't just focus on history, because that's again, the history is absolutely important. We need to know how we got here. But when we only focus on history, it's very easy to say, well, get over it. What is the problem? Why are Indigenous peoples making these unreasonable demands and claims? This is from the past, and that's not the case. Needs to be current. It also needs to be treaty focused. So, not only in the sense of the legal treaty agreements, of course, those are important, and uh, newcomers should absolutely understand that. But also the spirit of treaty, right? And that, everyone are living side by side, that nation to nation sovereignty and respect uh, and good way of living. And any new resources, if they're going to be effective at all, must reject a damage or deficit model. So it can't just talk about Indigenous peoples in the past, and it can't just talk about the past or past wrongs. It has to do that, yes, but that can't be it. It also needs to talk about the cultures and the celebrations and the diversity. Um, and in terms of rejecting that damage or deficit model, that should go for our newcomers as well. And so researchers who are looking at, newcomer attitudes, right, as we saw, right, our newcomers are very capable agents as well, right? Especially those with precarious immigration status. You think about, okay, our group had their own experiences with colonialism, with racism back in Afghanistan. So even when they heard the stereotypes, right, or saw them in the movies, again, they didn't know why, but they knew it just didn't sit well with them. They knew that something was wrong. And so we can't also, in the same way, we can't be thinking about Indigenous peoples all as one monolithic group. We can't be doing that for our newcomers either, because what our research showed, what our playback event showed, was that there's actually opportunities for for fostering really rich, really generative intercultural dialogue that's inherently decolonial by coming together and meeting each other beyond just a surface level way, but sharing stories and becoming inspired from each other. So back to the fireworks. I'm going to leave you with two things before we open it up for our question period here. The firework activity at the end of the playback session is where the moderator for the playback theater asks everyone. So this includes the actors, you know, everybody in the audience, which I was a member of as well, for their big takeaway words. So it's like a one, two, three, and then just say like a word or two that's in your head that you're left with. What are your big takeaways? And they were awesome. Live for the moment, solidarity, connecting to music and theater, family, connection, and gratitude. And so that was amazing. And our work didn't end there. And so thinking back to work that is not only respectful but and relational but reciprocal, it was also important to have a give back event. So after the research event, we held another playback event with our same group and even a few other community members who were interested in joining. And there were no one had a pen and paper. No one was recording anything. This was not a research event. This was simply a give back event to show gratitude. It was a chance to meet, share a meal. If you recall earlier, I mentioned that the group came to us because they did Theater of the Oppressed, a form of playback theater back in Kabul. Uh, they also wanted a chance to take the lead and do some activities. So they were also the moderators. So we were all learning together and looking at how playback was done, but in Afghanistan. So it was an afternoon of stories and food and fun, some tears and some laughs. So just that give back of something that they wanted to do. They wanted to meet again with the playback again with no agenda except to be to have good relations and continue our relations, and rather than treating people like a research subject and going um to continue that relationship. So with that, I will conclude. Hi, thank you for listening. And then I'll turn it back over to Saad, and we'll open it up for questions and such.